Hello, everyone, and welcome to Getting Real with Paula. Tonight, we are talking resilience with Roger Cheetham. Roger has used his horrific experience to master resilience on his own terms. He is now an international keynote speaker, as well as a resilience coach for individuals as well as corporations. For most of us around the globe, the end of year celebrations this year come with public health restrictions and a heavier burden when it comes to gatherings. The uncertainty brought on by COVID is creating all kinds of challenge for most of us. And unfortunately, COVID is the uninvited guest in our midst. Roger is going to enlighten us with some tips and tools to build our own resilience, regardless of life struggle. So therefore, I am asking you, pull out pen and paper, because I am telling you there will be gems dropped on this episode, and you will want to remember these afterwards. So, can you tell us a little bit about you, your journey, and what brought you to pick resilience building as your message to the world?
I certainly can, Paula. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me on your show. My name is Roger Cheetham, founder of Transformational Resilience, and I come to you live today from my home in England, UK. So not only are we in different time zones, we're actually on different days at the moment. My experience with resilience came to light on the 9th of June 2013. Prior to that, I had been what we would call here in the UK a pub landlord, a licensee, a publican. I guess to yourselves, it would probably be what you would call a bar manager. And given that in the UK pub trade has been ever diminishing for a number of years now, I guess the first example of resilience in this talk was succeeding in that industry for over 13 years, though it's not a word I would have used in everyday vocabulary back then. The 9th of June was significant as we'd had a non-eventful day in the bar. I'd been working alone on my feet for over 12 hours. After closing time, I'd taken the family dog Jasper for his end of evening walk. I left the pub that evening as a dog walker and ended up that walk an attempted murder victim, as there were 3 unknown people wearing masks waiting for me on a street corner as I made my way back to the pub, who beat me so severely that I was left for dead in the road, which was the start of my transformation. I was literally scraped into an ambulance within minutes of that attack and rushed to hospital, where I overheard through the cubicle curtain the trauma consultant telling my wife Claire that I probably wouldn't make it through the night, and if I did make it through the night, that I would never walk again, even aided. And I think the pair of elbow crutches behind me tells you that even though I do still need an aid, firstly, I am alive, and secondly, I am able to walk again, albeit aided. That did lead to a 3 months plus stay in hospital, and most of that in isolation, as in addition to all the physical injuries I was coping with, within 1 week of being in hospital, I also contracted MRSA, which led to that hospital stay being in isolation. And then over 3 months later, on the 18th of September that year, when I was discharged from hospital, I still had another year convalescing at home, not just housebound, but family living room bound, as my injuries were so severe I wasn't able to navigate stairs. I wasn't really able to leave the house other than for the average of 14 outpatients appointments a week I was going. And the reason I tell you this is not as a pity party or a sympathy grab. It's simply to let you know that if you have been struggling and having a hard time during COVID, during the pandemic, during the various lockdowns of varying stages over the past few months, and you're fed up of people saying to you, "Oh, I know how you feel," when you're thinking you absolutely don't, then I share that experience with you to let you know from my own experience that I really do understand what you're going through. And I don't mind sharing with you that this time round, when we were told back in March that here in the UK we were going into full lockdown, my initial thoughts were, oh no, please, not all over again. I am pleased to say that I have adopted my own teachings on resilience through this time, and here we are months later. I can share hand on heart, not only do I feel like I'm a survivor, I feel like I'm one of the few that has actually thrived throughout lockdown. So that's the story. That's what led to that time. During the period of convalescing, it was quite a dark time. In my true story of resilience keynote speech, which I've delivered internationally, I quite often speak of the magnolia walls reflecting my magnolia existence. And one of the things that did keep going through my mind is that people will do more for others than they will do for themselves. So initially I took the focus off myself, put it on my wife Claire, who had been an absolute rock throughout my hospital stay and my time of convalescence, and also our then 15-year-old daughter Tash, who was studying for her school leaver exams at the time. So that, in short, and believe me, that is short for someone who shares that so often as a keynote speech, is what led me to become interested in resilience. As I say, resilience has always been there in the 13 years in the pub trade. It's just not something I recognised as being there until it came to looking back. And that is what has led me to now sharing the stages, the digital platforms, the workshops, etc., as a expert on the subject of resilience.
Thank you, thank you. We seem to have an echo lag when we're talking, so I'm not sure what's happening because we were talking earlier and things were great. What I will ask, can you define what resilience is to you and what it brought to your work on life?
I absolutely can, yes. And I always like to start whenever I'm asked that question by giving the dictionary definitions of resilience. because it's a word that we hear bandied about in the media, in the news, and everywhere we go at the moment. But how much do we actually understand what resilience is? So the dictionary definitions that I like to quote are the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful after something bad happens. And the other one is the ability of something to return to its original state after being bent, pulled, or stretched, etc. And the example given is nylon. Well, given that since the attack I no longer have the legs for nylons, let's move on to the psychologist definition, which is simply the ability to adapt to trauma. Now, the issue I have with all those definitions is that they portray resilience as some kind of parachute, which is only deployed as we're hurtling through the depths towards adversity, whereas I tend to see it as more of a positive, and my own definition of resilience is the ability to keep going through the difficult times, bounce back from the hard times, and spring forward to the great times, which I assure you really are ahead. And I know in the current situation that probably takes some believing, but I'm a big believer in the saying that this too will pass. So I do think there's an important part of resilience which is about springing forward to the great times, often referred to as mental toughness, but I believe that is still resilience. And what that has brought to me, to answer the other part of your question, is optimism and the opportunity to turn my situation from a negative that happened to me not only into a positive that happened for me, but that has happened for the benefit of several other people around the world, that I have been able to go on and use my resilience story and my resilience teachings to help give hope in their lives.
Thank you. I have to say, I like the quote of happens to you happens for you. My experience has been that regardless of what we see as trials in our journey, reality is meant for us to learn something. It is meant for us to develop some competency or some skill sets. So that's where we go with the expression happens for you. So I've heard you mention mental health. Tell me to you what would be the connection between mental and resilience. Are they different?
The connection between resilience and mental health. Well, firstly, I would just like to say that mental health is indeed a real illness. It isn't a taboo, and it is not something that anyone should be ashamed of. And I know that isn't always the case as it should be, in that if someone has a physical injury, such as a broken arm or a broken leg, and they have a plaster cast, then people are curious about that. They will ask after their welfare, they will want to sign the plaster cast, etc. Whereas many times when someone says to someone else they have a mental health issue, the other person will make an excuse to get out of there as fast as they can. And I am aware that we are moving away from that now, which is great to see. I would also like to say that I am no mental health professional, and there are some fantastic mental health professionals out there, the psychiatrists, the clinical psychologists, etc. So if anything I say conflicts with professional advice you're given, please do favour the professional advice over what I share, because what I'm about to share is based purely on my own experience with mental health. And I do feel like I'm well qualified to speak on that, as when three unknown people try and take your life and you've no idea who they are or why they try and do so, then that certainly does have an impact on your mental health. And when you're in a isolated hospital room and you wake up each morning having written an A to Z script of who you think the three people are, what you think their motives are, and who you think paid them to try and take your life, then if there's one thing that's worse for your mental health than knowing three people have tried to take your life, it's when in your head you've suddenly decided there are 50 people, all with valid motives to want you dead. Obviously that is a nonsense, but that is the situation I found myself in at the time. I believe that the biggest contributors to mental health are overwhelm, also how harsh we can be with ourselves, and the one very relevant to the moment being isolation. And I think, just to quickly go into the potential solutions to those, the overwhelm is not to put ourselves under so much pressure and not to allow ourselves to be put under pressure by others. There's a lot to be gained from the art and the strength of being able to use the word no. When you know that you're already at capacity, rather than wanting to please others by saying yes to everything, then saying no can certainly help you with your own mental health. So there's that one there. Also, I would say when it comes to how we are with ourselves, I think it was only yesterday during the series of videos I've been doing for the advent calendar of resilience, I was talking about the subject of self-talk and sharing that the way we talk to ourselves in a negative way on occasion, if we were to speak to another person like that, it would be seen as bullying, which is obviously never acceptable. So why do we accept it when we are that harsh with ourselves? And also on the subject of isolation, which obviously I'm a bit of a world expert in from the story I've just shared with you, I particularly have an issue with the term social isolation, which is something, or social distancing rather, which has been bandied about quite a lot worldwide during the times of lockdown, as I understand the need for physical distancing, but physical distancing doesn't necessarily have to mean social distancing. And for those of us who are tech savvy enough to be able to use a platform such as this one, then we're able to hear and see pictures and voices of other people. Although for those of us that saw, anyone that saw us with the platform this evening wouldn't think that of us, would they? But we got there in the end. For anyone that's not as tech savvy, then picking up the telephone and giving someone a call and just having that listening ear can be really helpful on that front. So they are just a few of the elements that I believe contribute to mental health, and my brief overview tips on how you can take the first steps to using resilience to address that.
So, I like some of the tips you've mentioned from the perspective that we are now having to rethink the way we engage with others. And so sometimes we're going back to the way things used to be in order to reconnect with people. And that's sometimes the challenge is technology can for certain people worsen that sense of isolation, because it's like a tease, but can't give you the hug. I can't talk. So we have to reweigh we see things and we accustomed to see things. I'm gonna ask you a question. You've mentioned isolation when you were right after your attack. What are some of the lessons learned and or during that isolation that could be applicable to the current pandemic and public health restriction?
Okay, I often in my true story of resilience keynote speech talk about a life of resilience, and the reason I call it that is because life is the acronym that was born out of my time in isolation, and it's my 4-step process for dealing with isolation and being more resilient in life. The L standing for look at life through a lens of gratitude. Look for those silver linings in each cloud and how you can be grateful in that moment. And I have often been asked, well, we're in a pandemic, this lockdown has gone on for months. What can you be grateful for? And based on the story that I shared at the beginning of this interview, my answer is simply, I am grateful for still being alive today to witness this pandemic and be part of it, because given I was so close to that not being the case, that has made me very grateful for that. The second one, the second letter is I, which is imagine how you can do things differently, which we've already touched upon, in that normally if I was giving this talk, firstly, I wouldn't be doing it at coming up to 1 o'clock in the morning, but I would normally be delivering it from an in-person stage, which is something which isn't available at the moment. And whilst I'm a firm believer that there is no replacement for the personal energy in a room and for being able to give someone a hug and being able to look into your audience's eyes and see their emotion, whilst that's nowhere near as easy on Zoom, again, back to linking that with gratitude, I think we should be grateful for the fact we have the technology of laptops and tablets, etc. We should be grateful for having Wi-Fi to being able to do this. And I just think if we were going back to the 1980s and this was happening, when the best technology we'd got was very much the Sinclair ZX Spectrum or the Commodore 64, then I think we would find this pandemic so much worse than it is at the moment. So the I is about imagining how you can do things different and being adaptable. We've talked about the fact we've got onto Zoom and various other online platforms to be able to do things like this, which have replaced the live events. The large companies, which when we got into lockdown, immediately were able to adapt and have their workers working from home and adapt the whole way that we do business has been another example of that. Also, I would say, which again I touched on in my story, the F of life is find a big enough reason why. And for me, that was finding a why external to myself that you're not going to give up on. Choose how testing things get, and even when you're in isolation, you can be doing things to make a difference for others. And the E of the life acronym is empathy, being able to share and understand the thoughts and feelings of another, even if they're not in alignment with your own. So they would be my top 4 tips. And obviously they're 4 of many. As I mentioned earlier, I have been running a series of advent calendar of resilience videos throughout the month of December, which is available on Facebook, LinkedIn and YouTube. So if anyone's looking for more than those 4 tips. Obviously, we can only focus on so much within the time we have for this interview, but they're just 4 that were actually born out of my own time in isolation and still remain as true to me today during the pandemic as they were back in 2013 when I faced that extended time of isolation.
What or tools you can share to help them build or strengthen their own right thing they can apply, let's just say tomorrow?
Right, the audio was really breaking up there, Paul. I think the question was, what tools can people apply to build their resilience right away? Was that the correct question? I just didn't want to answer a question you'd not asked me.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
We seem to be losing. Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? I think the 4 things I just touched on there for the life
yes,
acronym,
now I'm hearing you.
That people could do straight away. In addition to that, I'm a big believer in things like meditation, which I smile every time I start answering a question with that, because I often joke that being a Yorkshireman and being a former publican, I probably have 1 foot in 2 of the most cynical camps that there are out there. So when I was first encouraged to meditate, I had the idea of men dressed in orange with ponytails, sat cross-legged and saying Om. And I'm not taking anything away from that, but I just didn't see that being for me. And I think that is quite a common misconception. What I have gone on to realise is that meditating is purely about avoiding that overwhelm by taking time out for yourself. Like, quite often we feel so refreshed when we take a holiday or vacation, depending which side of the pond you are. We feel so refreshed. However, 2 weeks out of a year is not really enough to refresh us, whereas something such as meditation, actually taking time out of your busy schedule for yourself, just to switch off to the world, switch off to overwhelm, and have what I would term as me time, is something which I now find priceless. And if I was to go back to my former publican colleagues and tell them that meditating was part of a daily routine, they simply wouldn't believe me, if I'm honest. Another one is affirmations, where, as we spoke about, people having negative self-talk and how harsh we can be with ourselves at times, having an affirmation, a positive statement that begins with I am, can be also very helpful indeed if we get into the habit of using positive affirmations to talk to ourselves rather than the harsh self-talk. Visualization, again, is something else that I feel can really work. And again, my tip with visualization, so many people, when they visualize, they're looking at themselves. Whereas I believe if you're going to visualize something in a positive way, you need to be looking at the colors, you need to be hearing the sounds, even smelling the smells of the situation you're picturing yourself in, but doing it through your own eyes, what you would see if you were there in the moment, rather than looking at yourself as though you were an observer. I think there's a lot to be said as well about physical exercise. I mean, again, back to the elbow crutches, I could easily say, oh, I have disabilities, therefore I'm not able to exercise. Again, that would be a case of what you tell yourself. I mean, for me, I visit a community gym at least once a week. And yes, I do have constraints rather, that I'm not going to be trying to bench press my own body weight or anything like that. However, the exercise bike, the arm bike, the rowing machine are all operated from a seated position, so there's nothing to stop me doing what I am able to do within those constraints. I can honestly say, hand on heart, when I come out from a physical exercise workout, I'm absolutely pumped up. I have high energy and feel like I could take on any challenge. So there certainly is a connection there between physical exercise and your own mental resilience, to come back to what we were talking about earlier on, when we were saying how mental health is connected with resilience. So they're just a few that I would suggest to get people started, in addition to the ones I mentioned within the LIFE acronym.
Thank you. I'm happy to see that quite a few things you've mentioned I've already incorporated into my own journey. Definitely, daily physical exercise is something that we should all consider, especially if you're working from home. So you have to figure out a way to exercise, move the oxygen in your space and in your mind. And the other three, meditation, visualization, as well as affirmation, huge tools. It's a matter of finding what works for each of the individuals, because not all visualization or meditation would work for all people. I would strongly also recommend the affirmations, because that negative dialogue keep repeating. As they say, we are sometimes our own worst enemy if we're not paying attention. So I totally hear you on that. So, what would be one key message you would want to leave with our listeners for the upcoming holiday?
Right. I personally would like to say to each one of your listeners the phrase that I end every one of my talks with, that you are more than a survivor, you are a thriver. And we've just been talking about affirmations. So if you were looking for an original affirmation, if that's not something that you're familiar with, then look yourself in the mirror each morning and tell yourself, I am more than a survivor. I am a thriver. And that's not a bad affirmation whatsoever to get you started with and to set the tone for the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roger, for speaking on this topic. And you are also our last episode for 2020. So thank you for helping us close this year. To all of you out there, thank you for wrapping 2020 with me as well. I pray that the end of the year be kind to you and your loved ones. Do remember to be patient and kind with you and with others as well. In these times of uncertainty, most of us are already a little on the edge. So you want to ensure that you are taking care of yourself and the people around you. Stay safe, stay healthy. And I am looking forward to seeing you in 2021. Much love to all and stay blessed.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Paula. Bye bye. Bye, everyone.